goed. Of je bent niet verplicht en niet te voelen. Of ga er gewoon ook in. Neem van mee wat je mee wil nemen. Probeer er dingen van. Zo cool. De helft van de helft.
Maar dat is 5. De Red Army, zo heet het toch ook niet terroristen?
Red Army is toch met
Maar hoe heet die terroristen?
Red Army Action.
The obelisk in front of you is 40 meters high, about 131 feet, and was intended to be the main monument and symbol of the Sachsenhausen National Memorial of the GDR, opened in 1961. At the top, you can see 18 red triangles, which represent the 18 European countries from which the political prisoners interned in the concentration camp came. The names of the countries are listed on the base of the sculpture in front of the obelisk. There were different categories of prisoners who wore differently colored triangles on their uniforms that identified the group to which they belonged, often synonymous with the reason for their internment. However, there was search in vain for any evidence of the other colors that identified other ethnic, religious, or social prisoner groups like the Jews, Roma, and Sinti, Jehovah's Witnesses, or homosexuals, since their remembrance had no place in the politics of the GDR. The official remembrance policy of the GDR concentrated on the anti-fascist resistance against the Nazi regime of the German communists and the role of the Soviet Union in the final military subjugation of the Reich. This is also expressed in the sculpture entitled Liberation, which shows a Red Army soldier flanked by two prisoners. The sculptor, René Graetz, had to rework the group of figures several times over. The initially realistic version was the simply didn't fit into the official picture of the hero's fight against fascism that the GDR wanted to project. The Ministry of Culture of the GDR and the Sachsenhausen Committee, responsible for the planning and construction of the memorials, including the former prisoners on the board, required many changes to the work before they were satisfied, with the result that the Red Army soldier now looks more like the comrade-in-arms of the prisoners rather than their liberator. The national memorial sites at the concentration camps within the borders of the GDR had a central role in the cultural happenings of the state. Regular visits to the sites by school classes were obligatory. The large paved area with the speaker's podium in front of the obelisk serves to remind us of the political mass meetings held here in the days of the GDR, at which the SED, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, would proclaim itself the true heir and upholder of the legacy of the concentration camp victims. Here, soldiers of the National People's Army took their oath of allegiance, and the children and youth of the German Democratic Republic, the Junge Pioniere, and the Freie Deutsche Jugend vowed to uphold and advance the creed of the better Germany. To hear an excerpt of the speech given by the chairman of the Council of State of the GDR, Walter Ulbricht, at the opening of the Sachsenhausen National Memorial on April 21st, 1961, please enter the number 123 on your audio guide.
Concentration camp of Sachsenhausen, a special prisoners camp that the SS had built here in 1941, well-known public figures imprisoned, and for high-ranking Allied prisoners. A cobbled road, which you can still see today, separated the special prisoners camp into two areas: Sonderlager A along the camp wall, and Sonderlager B on the other side of the road. Before you lie the 15 original stone barracks of Sonderlager B, built in 1944 by concentration camp inmates. These are the only surviving buildings. The SS planned to keep prisoners here under more privileged conditions than in the main prisoners' camp, so these barracks were divided into two equal wings, each intended to hold just one prisoner, with a separate dormitory, day room, and washroom. Which particular prisoner of the SS held in which particular barrack is not known. On the other side of the road, opposite the stone barracks, were four family houses, with pointed gables, and a collection of wooden barracks further south. Nothing has survived of these buildings apart from fragments of the foundations. The houses were called Sonderhäuser, and were used for the internment of important politicians, former ministers, and even heads of state from the German-occupied territories. They also became known as Schuschnigg houses, after the former Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, who was held in one of them with his wife and child, born in captivity. After the failed coup attempt on the 20th of July 1944, the SS used two of the four wooden houses to intern 12 members of the Wittelsbach dynasty, including 9 children.
The prisoners in the wooden barracks included members of the high command of the Greek armed forces and a number of British officers. Stalin's eldest son, Yakov Chugashvili, who died in Sachsenhausen in 1943, was also imprisoned here. Compared to the inmates of the Bain prisoners' camp, the prisoners of the Sonderlager lived in far better conditions.
In the Soviet special camp, the former Sonderlager became Zone 2, with an eastern and a western sector. It between January and June 1946, the Soviet camp command imprisoned around 6,500 officers of the former German Wehrmacht in the barracks of the former Sonderlager of the concentration camp. They had been arrested once more on returning to their homes in Soviet-occupied Germany after being released from British or American prisoner of war camps.
This area was called Zone 2 by the Soviets and was expanded with additional wooden barracks right to the southern end of the cobbled road. The officers were deported to labor camps in the Soviet Union in the late summer of 1946.
In September 1946, the Soviet Secret Service, the NKVD, first began committing prisoners to Sachsenhausen who had been convicted by the Soviet Military Tribunal of real presumptive opposition to the occupying force. They were put in Zone 2. Up until the final dissolution of the Soviet Special Camp, more than 16,000 such offenders were held in Zone 2 of the Soviet Special Camp, many of them between the ages of 14 and 21 when they were arrested. The conditions in Zone 2 of the Special Camp were even worse than in Zone 1. Thousands died of hunger and disease.
Within Zone 2 of the camp, a separated area of 6 barracks constituted the Special Hospital Number 3577, a medical center for the treatment of venereal diseases under the administration of the Sachsenhausen Special Camp until December 1948. Of the estimated 3,300 patients treated, more than 90% were members of the Soviet Red Army forces. They were treated for their particular complaints and then assigned to punishment battalions or sent to labor camps of recovery. After the days of the Soviet Special Camp, the former Sonderlager, with its original stone barracks, was then used by the National People's Army as an ammunition depot. Barracks 25 to 28, which formed Block 4 of Zone 2 of the Soviet Special Camp, are today part of the exhibition of the history of the Soviet Special Camp. In 2 of the barracks, you can hear recordings of witnesses recounting their memories of the conditions of imprisonment in Zone 2. To listen to an excerpt from Kurt Weiss's account of life in the stone barracks, please enter the number 130 on your audio guide. Between 1945 and 1950, the Soviet Special Camp was established here using parts of the former concentration camp. This history of dual use is shared by Sachsenhausen with other former Nazi camps, such as Buchenwald or Jamlitz-Liberose. In the course of the replanning process that the Sachsenhausen Memorial underwent, this led to some controversy between the survivors of the concentration camp and the survivors of the Soviet Special Camp. The new separate Special Camp Museum consolidates the history of the Soviet Special Camp, illustrates the division between Zone 1 and Zone 2 of the camp under the Soviets, and is in direct line of sight to the mass grave and Special Camp Memorial in the command area on the one hand, and the remaining stone barracks on the other. The museum is visible through an opening in the original camp wall near Station Z of the former concentration camp as a black cube-shaped building designed to blend in with the landscape. The foundations of the building were specially lowered by about 1 meter, equivalent to about 3.5 feet, to ensure that it does not contrast with the proportions of the camp wall and the stone barracks. The fair-faced concrete surface of the building reflects its stark surroundings and structures in varying intensities, depending on the light and the angle of observance. The cube has only 2 narrow windows, which look out onto the cemetery of the stone barracks. The interior is nevertheless flooded with daylight through its flat glass roof. In addition to providing an insight into day-to-day life in the special camp, the exhibited objects and documents show the diversity of the inmates and the reasons for their internment. Numbering around 30,000 prisoners, the largest category was the so-called Special Contingent, Zone 1 especially, the former main prisoners' camp. These were often former members of the NSDAP party machinery, arrested and put into preventative detention as a matter of course on the basis of occupation directives for the denazification of Germany immediately after the capitulation, and imprisoned without any form of trial. This group mainly consisted of minor NSDAP functionaries, in particular known Blockleiter or Zellenleiter. Members of the SS, the Gestapo, the concentration camp command, high ministry officials, or public servants were also imprisoned here, but to a far smaller extent. The lower ranks of the Nazi youth organizations also belonged to this group of internees, as did known or suspected political enemies of the Soviets, or simply people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The second largest group of prisoners were those who had been sentenced for various offenses by the Soviet military tribunal, numbering some 16,000. Most of them had fallen foul of the Soviet occupation forces through acts of resistance, sometimes real, but sometimes imaginary, and all were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment on the basis of their confession, elicited after long hours of brutal interrogation and often torture. These prisoners were kept separate from the internees in Zone 2.
In the first half of 1946, around 6,500 officers of the Wehrmacht were detained as prisoners of war. Finally, the special camp also contained some 7,000 foreigners, mainly Russian immigrants, former forced labor workers under the Nazis, or else Red Army soldiers who had committed some offense or other.
The diversity of the prisoners and the different reasons for their imprisonment show that the Soviets obviously did not view the special camp as a pure denazification or transit camp, but also as an instrument of enforcing their totalitarian authority in the occupied territories.
In the exhibition, you can call up information on the individual objects by entering the numbers given.
angebrochen, aber ich war noch 10 Jahre. 10 Jahre.
Mein Name ist Horst, geboren 3.6.27 in Gera. Verhaftet am 20. Oktober 1945 in Gera. Verurteilt im April 46 zu 15 Jahren. 4000 Zwangsarbeiter gelegt.
Angefangen hat alles in Preußen in Thüringen. Auch von 4000 Einwohnern, wo plötzlich im Oktober bis Januar und insgesamt 38 Jugendliche verhaftet, aus Gründen, die keiner ahnt. Man merkte nur, es war irgendwie Gefahr, es war irgendwas los, die Russen holten ab, dann war die geholt.
Ich bin der Herr Schützer aus Nordrhein und bin über einen GPU-Keller in der Universität in Nordrhein nach Sachsenhausen gekommen, ins Gerichtsgefängnis, dort mit den Preußer Jungs zusammengekommen, mit Sachsenhausen, und von dort Oranienburg und Sachsenhausen.
Und als es dann klar ist, was danach passierte, habe ich dann gebeten, dass ich auch nicht wieder in der anderen Richtung ausmarschieren werde. Ja. Dann musste man ja noch nicht wegen Glas rechts liegt die Wohnung als Mauer.
Die zweite Bar blieb drin, die konnte rechts sehen, da ist eine andere drin, durch Fenster irgendwie durch ein gekratztes Loch oder so, nicht? Aber an sich wusste man nur, wir hätten da einen Bar gehabt. Das konnte man nicht wissen.
Und so wie heute noch die Fenster hier sind, so waren die damals. Nur wir hatten damals so wie die alten Fenster, die früher waren, wir kennen sie heute aus Althaus, so die Fenster hier. Und das war jetzt das Glas mit weißer Farbe. Die Farbe war eine Kalkfarbe, also keine Lackfarbe. Wir konnten sie mit dem Fingernagel abkratzen. Ja, und dann hat der eine oder der andere schon mal hier ein bisschen, an jedem Fenster wurde ein wenig gekratzt, ja, um zu sehen, da, jetzt habe ich geguckt, jetzt möchte ich sehen, was ist da draußen los. Die einzige Marke, die Zugang zu diesem Hof hatte, waren wir. Diese Marke schon, die hatte wieder Zugang zum anderen Hof. Allerdings waren die dann auch wieder hier abgemauert. Da ging ebenfalls noch eine Mauer durch. Ja? Also das möchte ich aber beinahe behaupten, dass es so war. Ja? Denn für uns war das eben deshalb so abscheulich und furchtbar, dass wir praktisch hier allein uns überlassen waren und wir konnten auch nicht den ganzen Tag raus. Es kam ganz darauf an, wie die Posten, die hier zuständig waren, Laune hatten. Dann haben sie uns mal die Baracke aufgeschlossen, dass wir raus konnten. Aber das war eben sehr selten. Und die waren sehr launig, die wir als Posten hier hatten. Ich bin immer morgens gerne früh aufgestanden und schnell auf die Toilette. Es war ja nur ein Becken, ein Toilettenbecken für alle 36 da und habe da schnell meine Dinge erledigt, komme zurück und meine beiden Bettnachbarn, Harry Bachmann und Rolf Polenski. Ich lag zwischen den beiden. Und ich packte die so an und sagte, Leute, das Badezimmer ist frei. Stellte sich heraus, wir waren beide zu, die waren über Nacht gestorben. Ich hatte mitten zwischen den beiden Toten gelegen. Wenn wir reinkommen, waren die Frühstück, so längs, etwa 40 cm auf Fußboden, die erste Lage und dann drüber wieder eine Lage. Wir lagen da drüben, das erste auf dieser Frische. So. Und wie gesagt, wir haben uns teilweise gegenseitig gewärmt unter einer Decke, soweit man eine hatte. Wir hatten nur unsere Wolldecke. Eine Wolldecke, einen Mantel. Und noch ein paar Sachen, die man sich so als Kopfteil. Ja.
Wer keine Decke hatte oder nichts mitbringen konnte aus Altstrelitz an warmen Sachen, der hatte natürlich Pech. Das waren auch die ersten, die teilweise hier vor uns sind. Die Brettchen waren blank. Kein Stroh, kein Strohsack, nichts. Erfolg war der, wenn sie nun schon so fahren, dass sich beide Seiten Becken aufgenäht haben. Alle.
Wir durften nicht arbeiten, wir durften nicht rausgehen, wir wurden überhaupt nicht auf den Hof gelassen. Wir durften nur hier drin in der Baracke sitzen und tätig sitzen und von Frühstück auf Mittag warten und von Mittag auf den Abend warten. Und wenn wir jetzt hier was anfertigten und versuchten ein Kartenspiel, irgendjemand, der so findig war oder der da Stricknadeln, dann war das ja ganz schlimm sogar. Denn wenn man beim nächsten Filzen die Stricknadeln an meinem Platz oder in meinen liegen gelassenen Textilien da findet oder auch, ich habe sie sonst so versteckt innerhalb der Baracke und man findet nachher mich als Besitzer da zu den Verbundenen, dann kam ich in den Karzer. Und ich weiß, da haben wir Weihnachtsbäume gebastelt. Also haben uns irgendwie einen Kiefernzweig, damals gab es hier in diesen Flächen noch ein paar Kiefern, von denen die Kiefernadeln runterfielen oder die Kiefernzweige. Und da haben wir uns aus Kiefernadeln einen Weihnachtsbaum gebastelt. Und um Kerzen zu haben, da haben wir uns Kutrex, das waren Mittel gegen Pilzläuse, was aber Alkohol enthält, sodass es brennbar ist. Und das haben wir in Röhrchen, in leeren Tablettenröhrchen, haben wir dann uns Weihnachtskerzen gebastelt. Es gab ja kaum Medikamente. Also wir haben zum Beispiel gegen Durchfall gab es zerstampfte Borkenrind, gegen Wassersucht gab es Kiefernadeln, die wurden gekaut. Gegen Wassersucht stellte man den Schemel, wir hatten ja in den verschiedenen Zimmern Schemel, die wir abends aufs Fußende des Bettes stellten und uns einen Gürtel zwischen die Stuhlbeine schnallten und darauf die Beine legten, damit die Beine hoch lagen und der Kopf niedrig, um eben das Wasser aus den Beinen herauszubekommen.
Mit der Hunger. Da könnte es passieren, dass man morgens früh aufwacht und der Nachbar rührte sich nicht mehr. Ne? Das konnte alles passieren.
Kamen dann die Totenträger und holten die ab, beziehungsweise im Laufe des Tages wurden die Toten hier in der 28 auf der rechten Seite in dem Leichenraum dazwischen gelagert.
Aber wo die nun hier alle beerdigt waren, das haben wir alles nicht mitgekriegt. Ne? Das wissen wir jetzt erst, wo die Massengräber sind. Ne? Wir haben damals gedacht, da hat es irgendwie hier im Lager verscharrt, aber Schmachten haben, das könnten wir hier alles nicht. Ne?
Abends wurden sie dann mit dem Karren hier hinten raus in die Massengräber geschmissen. Und das konnten wir sehr gut, hier in der Baracke 28 habe ich das eben sehr gut abends immer hören können, so nach 10, wenn es überall ein bisschen ruhig war. Und auf einmal kamen dann die knarrenden Geräusche wenn der Wagen kam. Und dann hörten wir Klatsch, 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 Klatsch. Dann haben wir gesagt, wieder 10 Tote oder 12 oder 15 Tote, die im Laufe des Tages angefallen waren und die da hinten in die Massengräber geschmissen wurden.
Wenn man zu den Gedenkstätten geht, zu den Massengräbern, dann kann man es ja auf den Tafeln auch sehen, dass auch da 14-Jährige dabei waren.
An einem Tag, Hans Garbe und Hans Pfeiffer sind am gleichen Tag an mir vorbeigetragen worden als Tote. Die waren beide auf der 27 hinten, sind da gestorben, der eine am Abend und der andere am nächsten Morgen. Zwei von den Kreuzern, meine Kreuzerkameraden.
Man hat praktisch stündlich ums Überleben gekämpft. Und zum Beispiel, wenn wir dann diese sogenannte Kaltverpflegung bekamen, das Brot aufteilen, das war eine Wissenschaft. Da wurden aus primitiven Dingen eine Brotwaage gezimmert, woran nachher die Brotstückchen gehängt werden, damit jeder das Gerechte bekommt.
Man spricht von Graupensuppe, weil wir tatsächlich 2 Löffel Graupen auf den 3/4 Liter Suppe haben wir vielleicht gefunden oder 3 Löffel, ja. Aber das andere war eben dünne Brühe, ja, und eine ganz dünne Suppe. Aber der eine, der mochte sie gerne, der hat dann eben mit dem anderen getauscht. Das wurde auch gemacht, ja. Aber das Hungergefühl ging ja davon nicht weg.
Keiner durfte über Essen sprechen. Keiner.
Ich sage das mal mit allem Vorbehalt, nicht zuletzt deswegen, weil etliche Kollegen schon gar nichts mehr zu sich nahmen. Das heißt, man kam in den Genuss der nicht aufgegessenen Portionen der todkranken Kameraden.
Und ich sage Ihnen ganz offen, ein Großteil, gerade mir, hat gesagt, es wäre besser gewesen. Man lässt uns nicht dahin siechen, sondern hätten uns lieber da erschießen sollen. Wir haben die teilweise beneidet, die sie damals im Buchenwald aus unserem Transport rausgeholt haben und dort erschossen haben. So, das ist Fakt. Sie können sich vorstellen, wie die menschlichen Psyche oder ausgesehen haben und wie die Menschen gedacht haben. Sie müssen sich vorstellen, sie haben Jahre, Monate nur Hunger und werden immer weniger. Da fragen Sie sich doch dann, was hat das Leben noch für Sinn? Wenn Sie wie ein Tier auf das bisschen Essen warten,
costume of the ones that were contemporary are aging nowadays. And my generation, the one after war, had touched the Holocaust. It's not my parents that were contemporary. Alternative theory that say the Holocaust did happen, but it was not so bloody as history wants to portray. It was not so much. Yeah, it wasn't. It was 6 million, it was 17 million, I remind. Or they also say
I don't know how to do. Maar hier staat dag, maand en jaar. Maar daar staat 93. Dat is toch niet in de... Nee, 98 of 95.
As a former immigrant, he spoke fluent Russian. In addition to the workshops of the industrial yard, other production sites also existed in the outside area of the camp command headquarters, known as the Outer Zone by the Soviets, and in the prison camps, in which prisoners were assigned to permanent work details. Temporary work details also existed for occasional or seasonal tasks, such as clearing work, felling timber, loading and unloading, harvesting, or extra duties in the kitchens, the vegetable cellars, or the bakery. The work details in the Soviet special camp were primarily established for the purpose of self-sufficiency, which means that the work was only undertaken to cover the immediate Station Z. 2 pits were discovered that contained several thick layers of human ashes. It was concluded that these were the remains of the large number of unknown victims of the concentration camp. Between the years of 1936 and 1945, several tens of thousands of prisoners were known to have been murdered and cremated in Sachsenhausen. These pits had been dug in the industrial yard at the orders of the SS in order to serve as repositories for the large amount of human ashes that needed to be disposed of. As late as February 1945, the then commandant of the camp, Anton Kleindl, had several tons of crematorium waste and human remains simply dumped in the Oder-Havel Canal near the clinker works in an attempt to hide at least some traces of the crimes committed in the camp. After the pits had been found, archaeologists carried out a more careful search of the industrial yard, which had obviously been the key area in the acts of extermination which had taken place in Sachsenhausen since 1940. In the south of the industrial yard, a further pit with cremated human remains was found, near the site of the first crematorium, next to Tower C. Statements from survivors of the camp led to the discovery of an internal road that one prisoner had termed the Path of Bones. Examinations of the soil there showed a far higher concentration of human ashes in this place than even in other parts of the industrial yard, and it appears that the road surface had been repaired using ashes from the crematorium at some time in the past. When interviewed about his internment, the former Polish prisoner Czesław Jasko remembered ashes were simply everywhere. In the course of the building work necessary for the reconstruction of Station Z, more such finds were unearthed, and the human remains in parts of the Path of Bones also had to be salvaged. For this reason, a reburial ground was designated west of the entrance to the The chances of surviving the concentration camp were slim. There were many ways in which prisoners could lose their lives. They could die of hunger, of diseases, of overwork, of the after effects of a beating, or in the course of a medical experiment. Deaths of this type were called normaler Abgang in the jargon of the SS, which is akin to saying the prisoners died of natural causes. In addition to this, individual prisoners or groups of prisoners were also executed, but in a manner that could be legally defined as murder, by being shot, hanged, or after 1943, gassed. These crimes are documented by the display Murder and Mass Murder in the Concentration Camp, 1936 to 1945, on the eastern wall of the camp. This was the place where, in the industrial yard on the other side, the so-called Station Z was located, with its crematorium, its Genickschussanlage, an installation for shooting prisoners in the base of the skull, its gas chamber, and its execution trench. The greatest single concerted act of mass murder in the history of Sachsenhausen was the execution of at least 10,000 Soviet prisoners of war in the late summer and autumn of 1941. Before being transferred to Sachsenhausen, these prisoners had been sorted out in prisoner of war camps of the Wehrmacht on the basis of Hitler's infamous Kommissar order, which ordered the summary execution of any political commissars and Jews among the Russian prisoners of war. In order to carry out the murders, the SS set up a temporary but complicated contraption for administering the Genickschuss, a single shot in the base of the skull, in a wooden hut not far from the execution trench. The prisoners were led into a room where an SS man in a white laboratory coat made a pretense of conducting a medical examination, in the course of which they had to stand against a stadiometer or height measurement rod affixed to one of the walls. The stadiometer had a hidden firing slit, through which an SS man in the next room shot the prisoners in the back of the head as they stood there. Military march music was played at high volume on a gramophone throughout the procedure to drown out any noises. In 1962, the prisoner Paul Sakowski, who was on forced duty during these murders, reported on what he had witnessed.
Sergeants Kessler and Dinggrafe, both wearing white coats, shouted at me to pull him out of the way. Only then did I see a naked man lying on the floor. I gripped him by the wrists and dragged him out into the hallway, where Vicar told me to put him with the other two corpses in the corner. As I dragged him through the wood shaving, I noticed he was leaving a trail of blood. In the corner, I turned the body around onto its front and saw a thin trickle of blood coming out of a small hole in the base of the man's head at the back.
The headshot installation, installed in the so-called Station Z building when it was built in 1942, worked along much the same lines. It was first used in May 1942, when 250 Jews were shot there. Most of the increasing number of murders that were committed by the SS in Sachsenhausen in the following years were carried out with the aid of the so-called headshot installation, the Genickschussanlage, in Station Z. As late as the spring of 1945, Summary executions took place here. These were of people caught looting after bombing raids, but also of prisoners, mainly women, suspected of sabotage at their place of work in the arms factories. Jews arriving from other camps that had already been evacuated were disposed of here, as were prisoners sorted out in the infirmary as being incapable of further work. In February 1945, the SS shot a number of Soviet, British, and Luxembourg military and police officers as a preventative measure, hoping to reduce the risk of a prisoners' revolt being led by men trained in military or paramilitary tactics. In the winter of 1941-42, while continuing the extermination of the Soviet prisoners of war, the SS also experimented with gassing trucks. These gas vans, as they became known, had been specially developed by the Crime Science Institute of Department II of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the main security office of the Reich, and were equipped with an airtight cabin into which the exhaust fumes of the vans were directly piped, the idea being that those locked into the cabin would suffocate and die of carbon monoxide poisoning. To listen to the report of the prisoner, Harry Naujoks, on the murder of the Soviet prisoners of war in Sachsenhausen, the greatest single act of organized mass murder to be carried out in the history of the concentration camp, please enter the number 124.